Okay, so the last part of life in Norman England is how do the Normans change the church? Remembering, of course, that the church is massively important. Every single person pretty much in England in 1066 went to church every week. It's the only place that peasants would hear official instructions or laws or have any contact with the actual state and the king himself because of what came down through the church. So, how did the Normans change the church then? Well, the first person you need to know about is this guy, Lanfranc. William brings him in from Normandy to change the English church because he's not pleased with it, okay? So the first thing to put at the top is, why are they doing all this? Right, well, William is a religious man, okay? And he wants to do penance. He effectively wants to say sorry for the bloodshed that he's committed by taking over at Hastings, but he also wants to use it to show power, effectively to show the English people that God is on their side, that he is a religious king, and that if he shows good standards of religion, that he is the rightful king of England. The last reason he starts doing all these things is because he's genuinely sort of disappointed with the English church. He thinks the English church is not up to scratch, so he decides to start making changes. Now he brings in someone who's been a bishop for him in Normandy. That's Lanfranc, who's the bishop of a place called Caen, C-A-E-N, and he brings him in almost like a troubleshooter and says, right, go and sort out the English church. Well, what does he do? Well, he gets rid of, for a start, things that are not allowed in European churches that were going on in English churches. So he gets rid of, so no more pluralism, okay? He gets rid of simony or simony, and he gets rid of nepotism. Now, pluralism is having more than one job. Simony means buying your job, so you get the power from it, so you pay to have the job. And nepotism means giving jobs to people who are your friends or your family. Now that's not allowed because it means you don't get the best, most religious person for the job in the church. You just end up with somebody who knows somebody or who can afford to buy it. Okay? So Lanfranc gets rid of all those things in the English church. What else does he do? Well, he changes the architecture of churches. Builds them out of stone, and they use the Romanesque and then Gothic styles of architecture for cathedrals and churches to make them look more impressive, to show the English that God's on their side effectively, but also for genuine religious reasons, to show the glory of God. They want, the Normans want to show the glory of God, and they want to improve the standards of the English church. Okay, what else does he do? Well, he changes the organisation. He gives bishops more control of each area. Okay, each area in the church is called a diocese, D-I-O-C-E-S-E, and he brings in new layers within the church organisation, people such as deans, so that it's easier to keep a track on what the priests at the bottom of the pile in the church are actually doing. So the church is better organised, there's more control and more people to organise it. And then lastly for this point, he makes it so that churches have their own courts. So clergy can only be tried in church courts. So it's just for clergy. Clergy meaning churchmen, like priests. They cannot be tried by people who are not priests themselves. One thing I would add is that actually the local priests mainly stay the same. So we are often talking about how far did the Normans change England. Well, in terms of the church, they changed the rules, they changed how it was built, they changed the organisation, they changed the courts, but the local priest in the local village would normally have stayed the same. The only difference is what they were being told to say and do would have been better controlled by Lanfranc and by the bishops, who were increasingly Normans, not English Anglo-Saxon people, and they would have been working in a different building. In Norman England, the church was also in charge of education. So what does the church do in terms of education? Well, the first thing that Lanfranc does is he makes the church and the schools separate. He puts them in separate buildings so that the church, the priest, is focusing entirely on God when he's meant to be doing that. Okay? Now, why do we need education in Northern England then? Well, it comes from this idea of the towns, doesn't it? Okay, the towns are where most of the schools that are run by the church are, because the towns need educated people to be traders and lawyers. In a village, it's less important. So there are several different types of school. There are the specific church schools themselves. Now, in a church school, that would be run by a monastery or a cathedral, and that is to produce the future monks, okay, the future churchmen or the future priests. So they learned things they would need for that job, like, for example, Latin, which was the official language of the church, and music, because monks have to chant and produce music as part of their service. Okay, there was also grammar schools, which gave a wider sort of education. They were also in Latin, but in this time it was more like a normal classroom where a teacher would sit in the middle and direct questions around the room. Now, a very, very small number of people in Northern England did go to university. There were universities, and it's worth flagging that up, because this is when university education actually began. We know, for example, that Oxford University was founded around 1096, so after William of Normandy had died, but still during the period of Norman England. The last thing that you need to know about education is, well, what language? What language was all this in? We know that the actual priests and monks themselves had to learn Latin. But what about the more normal schools? Well, essentially, it's French, unsurprisingly, because the Normans have taken over. But it becomes eventually something which is called Anglo-Norman, which is where after a few years or several years of the Normans controlling England, French and English start to merge together, and so you get something called Anglo-Norman. But again, if you get a question about changes to England under the Normans, you can say, well, actually, changes to education are quite large. They change the language, they introduce new types of schools, they separate schools out from cathedrals and monasteries, although they still run them. Okay, and I might just add that on there. They are still run by the church. And they even found, effectively, Oxford University in the period of Norman control of England. So there are big changes to education. The next part we need to know about then for Norman changes to the church is monasteries. So first of all, let's actually have a look at what is a monastery. Okay, because there's a bit of confusion sometimes between a church and a monastery. Well, essentially, a monastery is a religious house, okay, where monks live, okay, with monks. And the point of a monastery is that these people, monks, are devoted to God. So they spend their time studying the Bible, or they're fasting, which means they don't eat food, or they're meditating. They are away from society. They are not a church. The people do not come here on a Sunday for a church service. Alright? They are separated. Now, the last thing to point out before we start here is, as the Normans take over, it's really thought that these monasteries are in decline in terms of the number of monks that are in there and in terms of the sort of things they do. So, what do the Normans do about this? Well, this all comes under Lanfranc again, because he's reforming the entirety of the church, okay? And monasteries come as part of that, and the monks who live there. So the first thing that he essentially does is he tried to make it more like the European monasteries, like the monasteries that they have in Normandy. Well, how does he do that? Well, essentially, he makes the monasteries follow Benedictine rules. Benedictine, that's a really important key word. Okay, that's an E. Benedictine. Following the rules of Saint Benedict, okay? This is very common already for monasteries in Europe, but not in England. So what do you have to do if you are a Benedictine monk? Well, you have to take vows, essentially. So he makes all the monks in England follow these vows in Benedictine monasteries, okay? I'll put their vows. So what vows do you have to take? The first one is a vow of poverty. So that means that monks say they are not going to have wealth or personal possessions. The next one is the vow of chastity, which means that monks will not have sex, but also importantly will not do other pleasurable things such as eating sweet foods or drinking alcohol, because they need to focus on God. They take a vow of obedience. So they have to obey the teachings of God through the Bible, or the abbot, who would be the person who runs the monastery. And then lastly, they take a vow of stability, which is a vow that says they will never leave the monastic community. And in some cases, depending on the monastery, some monks take that to mean that they will actually never leave the monastery building or the area itself. Another change then, as I just mentioned, would be that Lanfranc, as he was reforming the monasteries, decided to make it very clear, okay, what rules the abbot, who was a monk who was in charge of the monastery, what powers he had, and the strict rules that monks had to follow. Now that obviously links to the vow of obedience, but he created a much better hierarchy for monasteries, so the monks knew exactly what rules they'd got to follow. He was very committed to this, was Lanfranc, and I'll just add over here that there is one occasion where monks were sort of refusing to follow these changes, and Lanfranc sent in knights, and 3 monks were killed because they would not follow these changes. So one last thing to sort of add here about monasteries is, this is an example, I'll go through there, of a really big change, okay? When the Normans take over England, monasteries are in decline, as it says there. Monks are not following the vows that they're supposed to have taken, and therefore William, and by extension Lanfranc, take it very seriously to try and improve the standard of religion and to try and make the monasteries more like they are in Europe. Okay. The last thing we need to know then about the church in Norman England is, what is the relationship like between the church and the king? And by the church, what we broadly mean is the Pope, because we've got to remember that at this time the Catholic Church is run, as it is today, the Catholic Church, by the Pope in Rome, and so there's always a slight tension between the King of England, who obviously controls England and nominally controls all of the priests and bishops, etc. in England, but also the Pope, because ultimately all those priests and bishops actually really swear allegiance to the Pope. So there's always a tension. So I'm going to just put that actually just as a little reminder on the top there, look, that there is tension going on here. Now, what we're going to do then is we're going to plot along our graph what the relationship between the various Norman kings and the popes is like. So down here we've got William I, William the Conqueror. Okay, he stays in power from 1066 when he takes over up to 1087. Then is his son, William II, known as William Rufus, and then Henry I. So beginning then with William I, William the Conqueror, his relations with the Pope tend to be quite good. They do fluctuate, and they also fluctuate depending on which Pope it is. But like we'll say, they start off quite well up here, and we'll label this in a second, because William has the papal banner at Hastings, so he's got the Pope's backing. The Pope believes that he should be the King of England, so I'll just put that up there. I'll put papal banner. Now, after the Battle of Hastings, Pope Alexander makes William do penance because he's done so much killing. So that takes him a little bit down there, the penance. But actually, William's happy to do that penance, and so therefore his relationship sort of goes back up like that. And actually, Pope Alexander is very pleased with what Lanfranc is doing to the English Church. He thinks the English Church has not been up to standard, and he's happy that, for example, William replaces English bishops with Norman ones. It does start to go downhill towards the end of William's reign though, just a little bit, because there's a new pope who's called Pope Gregory, and basically he tries to get more involved in the English church, and William doesn't like this, and he won't send his bishops to see Pope Gregory. He won't, even Lanfranc doesn't go to see Pope Gregory, so I'll put won't send bishops to Greg. That's Gregory. So if we got as far as 1087 when William I dies, probably relations are on the decline with the popes, because they started off quite well. The papal banner was there at Hastings, the Pope Alexander liked what Lanfranc was doing, but then the new Pope Gregory, he wanted effectively more power, and William I had spent long enough getting power in England, he wasn't going to give it away, so there's a little bit of a decline. Now we'll move on to William's son then, William II, William Rufus, and these relations between the church and the king continue, I'm afraid, to go downhill. Straight away in 1088 there is actually a rebellion against William Rufus. Now he manages to put down the rebellion, but he punishes the Prince Bishop of Durham, William St Calais, but he punishes him by putting him on trial in a secular court. Now that means not a church court, and as we learned in the legal section of the Normans video, church men were only meant to be tried by church courts. William St Calais and the rest of the church were not pleased, but William was showing he was in charge. He was not going to let the church tell him what to do. Now this only continued, okay, with another new pope, Pope Urban, and Pope Urban was very annoyed with William II because, a bit similar to William I with the bishops, William wouldn't let his new Archbishop of Canterbury, who was called Anselm, see the Pope, and the Pope's name then was Urban. Now what that was all about actually was about this thing called a pallium, which is an item of clothing that traditionally the Pope would give to a new Archbishop. Now the item of clothing itself is not that important, it's what it shows about William II and how he won't even follow the traditions of the church, so the relationship's really coming down there. Now towards the end of William II's reign, so we'll carry on down here to 1097, you can see relationships are right on the floor, because in the end Rufus actually exiled Anselm once he'd fallen out with him, and so Anselm had to go and live in Rome. So we can see that the Pope is not going to be very pleased that William II has treated the Archbishop, the Pope's, the Church's representative in England so badly. Now when William II dies in the year 1100 and the new king is Henry I, relationship between the Church and the king effectively really doesn't get any better at all. In fact, I'm going to draw as close as I can right down to the bottom of the line there, right down into the sort of sad part of the graph, because when Henry I comes in, Anselm, poor old Anselm, alright, he's still here, he's still supposed to be the Archbishop, but he refused to go and perform homage or give loyalty to Henry I, and so remained exiled. Sort of as a punishment for that, the Pope at this point gives a threat of excommunication. Excommunication, now that's a long word. What that basically means is that Henry I, the King of England, was threatened with being kicked out of the church. So there was a very real chance that the population of England would believe that they would all go to hell, which they all believed 100% existed, because their king had fallen out with Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and therefore fallen out with the Pope. And really, things do not get much better. For about another 4 years, the Pope issues his threat of excommunication in 1103. Well, it takes until 1107 for things just to start to pick up, because what happens here is called the Concordat, which means an agreement of London. And finally, at this point, Henry I, with the Pope, makes a compromise. And he says that although he can no longer choose who the bishops are, and he can no longer invest the bishops, he can receive homage or loyalty from them. So they will still have to admit that they are loyal to the king, sort of as well as the Pope. So we'll call that a compromise. So you can see how the relationship between the kings of England and the church started off sort of okay, began to collapse in William I's reign. It was pretty poor all the way through William II's reign, and it wasn't until Henry I was willing to make a compromise deal, okay, with another new pope. I'll put there, the pope here was Gregory. This time it was Gregory the 7th, okay. He was willing to make a compromise and admit that the pope would have some influence over the bishops, and that the king could not just choose who he saw fit and do the sort of investiture himself. That was part of the Pope's responsibility. So there is a very clear example all the way through of the tension, whereas William II just essentially didn't care and wasn't particularly religious and wanted to use the church for his own ends. It's not until Henry I is willing to make a deal that relationships start to get a little bit better. So if you were making a revision resource based on this, have in mind that pattern. It's up and down but fairly middling with William I. It's very poor with William II, and the recovery begins with Henry I.